Maybe we can have a little conversation here at the beginning tonight. What makes a movie different from a documentary? What makes a movie different from a documentary?
Typically, I think of a movie as having, narrative elements, not necessarily, based on reality. I guess I think of a documentary as more selected events and stories that are based on truth.
Okay, so maybe the most fundamental difference is we tend to think of documentaries as true and movies as fiction. Okay, what else?
Movies are more entertainment and documentaries are educational.
Okay, so movies are entertainment, documentaries are more educational. Doug mentioned an interesting word. He said something about a narrator. How are most documentaries told? But we usually have one person who's the voice. I'm all of a sudden just popped into my head March of the Penguins, the documentary that came out a number of years ago about penguins in Antarctica, and I can hear the narrator's voice, right, speaking that whole time. You hear other sounds, they interview other people, but there's this one underlying voice that runs through all of it that we call the narrator. Whereas a movie usually doesn't have at least a full-time narrator. You may have narrative bits where somebody, maybe if you remember the movie Forrest Gump, the different segments of that movie were broken up by usually the main character, Forrest, kind of narrating what was happening at that particular point in time. But then the rest of the movie is about, in most movies, how do we know what's going on? It's not a narrator, it's what else?
Usually it's a dialogue and action.
Okay, dialogue, action. And instead of a narrator, we have characters, right? Different people who are engaging in this dialogue and in these scenes and so forth. So are Bible stories more like documentaries or movies?
Interesting question.
Go ahead.
It has elements of both.
I think you're right. I mean, when Dub said the main difference between movies and documentaries is movies are fiction and documentaries are truth, well, that puts us squarely in the realm of the Bible being documentary, right? We believe it's true. It's not fiction. These are real historical events. These things really happened. These people really lived, all that sort of stuff. But how are Bible stories like movies?
It's definitely telling us a story.
Okay, so there's a story, there's a plot. Most documentaries don't have really a plot in the way that we think about movies having a plot. I mean, there's definitely, in some documentaries, at least there might be a urge to persuade somebody to believe something about this particular subject. And so there's maybe a movement of argument from here's a proposition, here's some evidence, and here's the conclusion I would like you to draw. We have some documentaries like that. But they don't really have a plot in that there's not a conflict and a resolution and all that sort of thing like we see in works of art and fiction. But there are definitely similarities between Bible stories and movies, right? Because we have scenes, and we have characters, and we have plot, and we have dialogue. But we also have a narrator, right? The parts that are not people speaking to each other. Somebody telling us, kind of sitting within, but a little bit outside of the story, telling us what's going on. I'd like to ask you to entertain the idea that Bible stories are quite a bit more like movies, really, than they are documentaries, except for that truth aspect. They are true stories, and the Bible is good history, but the way that they're told actually has more in common with movies than with documentaries, because of these things like scenes and characters and plot and dialogue. So to interpret these stories well, we really need to understand a few things about ancient Hebrew storytelling, because it's not modern Western storytelling, it's ancient Eastern storytelling. I introduced some of this last week, but I want to hit some of the key points again and add a few more pieces of information before we get into the story of Abraham. And I'm going to try to share my screen again. Hopefully it'll work out a little better than last week. I think I know a little bit more about how to use Zoom now. All right, can you guys see some of that?
Yeah.
Got a
Yeah.
nice,
Yes.
pretty picture of the flannelgraph with Noah and the ark and some animals. This is the way many of us were introduced to the Old Testament stories, especially. I remember growing up in classrooms in the barracks at Green Lawn,
See this.
with my teachers telling me stories on the flannelgraph. Well, what are narratives? Well, Old Testament narratives are accounts of historical events that are intended to communicate meaning to their audience. We can really only arrive at the true meaning of the text when we move beyond just the events and carefully consider the account in which the events are presented. So we talked about this a little bit last week, the level of event, the level of account, and the combination of those leading to the meaning that we draw from any particular text. Here are a couple more things about Old Testament narratives that I think are kind of interesting and useful for us to think about as we get started. Old Testament narratives are scenic. The big idea here is that the plot is driven by scenes involving characters and dialogue. These stories use elements of subtlety. Meaning is often conveyed indirectly. It's actually rare for the narrator to step in and make evaluative statements, but when they do, it's really important that we pay attention to them. Instead, the sum total of the presentation is actually the thing that's intended to convey meaning. And these stories are succinct. Old Testament stories are always told with a remarkable economy of words. Think about even just tonight, Genesis 12 through 22. We're going to cover a lot of years. Now, a lot of them get wrapped up in chapter 23, actually, when we hear the rest of the Abraham story, but we've got minimum of 25 years, probably closer to 40 years covered in these 11 chapters or so. Scenes usually involved only 2 or 3 characters or groups, which helps the story to remain really focused. And the narrator moves the story along rapidly, but slows down the plot with dialogue. And oftentimes when we get to dialogue, it's like real time. It slows down that slow to where we're reading things in roughly the same amount of time that they would have actually occurred as these discussions are unfolding. There's several key elements of narratives. We have, as we mentioned previously, the narrator. The narrator knows everything. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about this much, but when you're reading it, the narrator will often tell you what God thinks about something. They know everything. Remember, they're inspired authors. And I used the idea last week that I've heard before of these stories being God's interpretation of history, right? Because they're inspired through his writers to communicate the message he wants us to hear. So the narrator knows everything, but they selectively relate only a portion of what they know. They usually have a point of view. That is, they're telling the story from a particular perspective. It reveals the attitude of the narrator toward the story that they're telling. For example, in the Joseph story that we'll look at the end of our series, Joseph provides the interpretation of events. In chapter 50 of Genesis, it says, "You intended this for harm," speaking to his brothers, "but God meant it for good." Well, those are words in Joseph's mouth. But Joseph's interpretation is almost certainly shared by the narrator, because that's actually one of the key ideas that they're trying to communicate to us in that particular story. The narrator, as I mentioned previously, rarely comments, explains, or evaluates as the story unfolds. Instead, those things happen through the words and actions of the characters in the story. And that's kind of the next, or an element of the next element of narratives. Characterization. We learn about characters, about what they do, what they say, what's said about them, usually not by explicit descriptions. Sometimes characterization is established by back-to-back stories with similar elements that promote a comparison between the two. We're actually going to look at that tonight with Abraham and Lot. There's another one in the Joseph story that highlights differences between Joseph and Judah. Another element is dialogue. Characterization occurs mainly through dialogue. We hear what people are saying. In several cases tonight even, we'll hear what the narrator knows Abram and Sarah were thinking. And they share that in the form of quotes or words like dialogue. So we got to pay attention when people start speaking, because that's a key way that the writers are using to help us understand who these people are and what their involvement in the story is. These narratives also have patterns. Maybe the most simple one is some form of repetition that ranges from words to entire speeches, even into themes and sequences. Think about Judges, for example. Remember how there's kind of this cycle that we read about in Judges, where the people rebel against God, so God sends an enemy to afflict them, and then they cry out to God, and God raises up a judge, and the judge establishes peace in the land, and the people return to God. But we see that cycle go over and over and over until at the end, they don't cry out anymore, and God doesn't save them, right? When things degenerate so badly. But that pattern helps us interpret what's going on, and especially when the pattern breaks, we recognize it. Another kind of pattern is inclusion. We talked about this actually last week when we were introducing Matthew. Remember, I talked a little bit about Matthew, how at the beginning it says, "You shall name him Emmanuel," which means God with us. And then at the end of Matthew, Jesus says, "And lo, I am with you always." And he doesn't actually ascend in Matthew's account. We have similar ideas at the beginning and the end of the story that help us to interpret what comes in between. Dub mentioned some patterns like chiasm, where you have A, B, B, A, or A, B, and then something else in the center, and then B, A out, so that you see how there's kind of these patterns that unfold in the actions or words that happen in a story, and so forth. So narratives have all of these kinds of elements. So let's get into a story where we can see some of these things at work. Anytime you think about Abraham, you probably also think about Paul writing in Romans. And I'm looking at Romans chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, where Paul wrote, "In hope he believed against hope, that he should become the father of many nations. As he had been told, so shall your offspring be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. That is why his faith was counted to him as righteousness." Now, if we read about Abraham in the book of Genesis, we might wonder, was Paul writing about this Abraham? The Abraham that we read about in Genesis doesn't seem fully convinced. In fact, at several points in the story, his faith does seem to weaken. So let's look at the story and try to figure out why Paul could write these words about Abraham and his faith over in Romans. I'd like to kind of walk through the events of the story of Abraham. Remember how we talked about narratives are accounts of historical events. Events is kind of the lowest level. It's what happened. We can answer questions like who, what, where, when, how. The facts of the story, just the facts, right? So let's kind of walk through the story of Abraham piece by piece, starting in Genesis chapter 12. God calls Abraham and says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." And Abram obeys. He goes. When he gets there, a few verses later, still in chapter 12, he builds an altar and he calls on the name of the Lord. There's a famine. They go down to Egypt, and he calls Sarai his sister, his wife. He calls his wife his sister. This is discovered by Pharaoh, and they're sent away with gifts. We move on to chapter 13. Remember that Abram traveled with his family. He has his nephew Lot with him. Well, they're doing really well, so well that the land can't support both of them, and there's becoming friction between them and their herdsmen. So they separate. And we all remember the story. Lot chooses the good land near Sodom, and God restates his promise to Abraham there in chapter 13. In chapter 14, there's a long section that's just the narrator talking about a war, a battle that goes on between two sets of kings. But in the process, Lot and his family and his goods are taken away from Sodom. But Abram goes after him, rescues Lot, and when he returns, the king of Sodom comes out to give him spoils, but he refuses those, and instead, he actually gives a tenth of everything to the priest of the Most High God, Melchizedek. In chapter 15, Yahweh formalizes his covenant with Abraham. He tells him that he's going to have offspring. He tells him he's going to have a son. He tells him he's going to have this land, and he formalizes it. If you remember the dream sequence where Abraham falls into a deep sleep, and a great darkness fell upon him, looking at chapter 15, verse 12. Then the Lord said to Abram, and so on and so forth. The pot and everything floating down between the halves of the animals that are split. And if we look into some historical context here, we'd learn that this was a common way for the formalization of a covenant between two parties, was to split the animals. And the concept seems to have been, may this happen to us, be split in half, may we die, essentially, if we violate the covenant. And notice that this is a covenant that God makes with Abram. So chapter 16, Sarai gives Hagar, her servant, to Abram in order to maybe produce a child. And in fact, Hagar does conceive. Sarah mistreats her. Hagar leaves and returns after an incident out in the wilderness, and Ishmael is born. In chapter 17, Yahweh establishes the covenant of circumcision with Abraham. He changes Abram's name to Abraham, changes Sarai's name to Sarah, and specifically promises a son by Sarah. And then Abraham makes good on the covenant. He circumcises everyone, every male in his household, whether born there or purchased. The first part of chapter 18, Yahweh appears to Abram and promises again a son by Sarah. In the latter part of that chapter, or actually, I guess kind of the middle on to the end, Yahweh discusses Sodom and Gomorrah with Abraham. And you might remember the scene of Abraham bargaining with God over the righteous souls remaining in Sodom. 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10, right? And so Abraham bargains. In chapter 19, angels visit Sodom. They're taken in by Lot, who's prepared to offer them hospitality. You remember the vileness of the men of the town wanting to have sex with these men, wanting them to come out and engage in those acts with them. But the angel tell Lot at that point, we're about to destroy this place. Get ready to flee. And in the last part of that chapter, Yahweh does indeed destroy Sodom. Lot and his daughters and his wife leave, but his wife looks back. She turns into a pillar of salt. At the end of chapter 19, we have another uncomfortable story. You know, we censor a lot of this with our kids, don't we? I don't remember a flannelgraph story about Lot and his daughters. But they engage in immoral behavior with their own father, and through them, 2 children are born who become peoples of their own, who in later years are enemies of Israel. In chapter 20, Abraham goes to Gerar, to the realm of Abimelech, and he says, Sarah's my sister. Abimelech is told by God that this is not a good thing that he has done. He professes his innocence. He chastises Abraham and gives Sarah back to Abraham without anything having happened. In chapter 21, finally, Isaac is born, the child of the promise, born to Abraham and Sarah in their very old age. And after this happens, Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away after God reassures him that he will take care of them and make Ishmael into a great nation himself. They go out into the wilderness. God rescues Ishmael and Hagar by showing them some water. Toward the end of chapter 21, Abraham and Abimelech make a treaty. And then we have chapter 22, the one that's depicted in the flannelgraph scene that I'm showing on the screen right now, where Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac. He's ready to obey, but the angel stops him. He sees a ram caught in the thicket and sacrifices that instead, and then he goes on home. So those are the basic events of the story of Abraham. And we can do, it's nice to know those facts of the story, to remember the sequence of events, to have the pictures in our mind of all the things that Abraham experienced. But there's a sense in which everything that comes before culminates in chapter 22. And so the arrangement of the material and the way that it is told actually tell us quite a bit about, well, what the narrator wants us to know about these events and the characters involved, remembering also that God is a character in his own story. So what I'd like to do with the rest of our time is talk about some of the notable characteristics of the account. Things that kind of stand out to me when I look at this story, and help me to see a bigger picture perhaps than we get if we look only at the facts of the story, the events of the story. So I want to talk about 2 things basically. The characterization of Abraham is the first. And then the other is a particular word or word form that is repeated throughout this story that kind of pulls everything together. When we think about characterization, all we're really talking about is how do we come to know who this person is? Not just their name, not just where they're from, but who are they really? We would talk about it with each other as getting to know someone. And the writer gives us information to help us understand who Abraham is and what's going on in these stories. And this is often done through some form of comparison. And the first comparison I want to look at is how Abraham compares with Lot. And we can see this really clearly in chapters 18 and 19. So if you have your Bible and can look at those, fortunately mine is arranged where they both appear on the same pages, one on the left, one on the right, so I can jump back and forth between them very easily. But what I'd like to do is just show you some of the similarities between these stories. For example, where was Abraham when the men came? Well, he was sitting at the door of his tent. Where was Lot when the angels came to Sodom? Well, he was sitting in the gate of Sodom. What did Abraham do when he saw them come? He ran to them. Verse 2. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. What did Lot do? Well, something similar, but not exactly the same. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, My lords. So both of them greeted them positively, respectfully. They both bowed, but Abraham ran to meet them and to invite them in. Whereas Lot, it's like he just stood up and said, Hey guys, good to see you. Why don't you come to my house? Both good things, but slightly different. Look at what Abraham did in verses 4 and 5. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. Well, look what Lot says. My lords, please turn aside for your servant's house, and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way. Right? Similarities. Verses 6 through 8, look at Abraham. He's a ball of action, right? Abraham went quickly to the tent to tell Sarah and said, Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. Look at all the action. Look at the detail that we hear about what Abraham did for these gentlemen. Right? Hospitality for sure, but lots of verbs, lots of action, lots of detail. What did Lot do? Well, we're not told anything about how he went about doing it. That's a complete blank in that part of the story. What did Abraham actually offer them? He offered them cakes. Right? Not unleavened bread. This is leavened bread, cakes, calf, the fatted calf, a young calf, tender and good. Lot gave a generic feast with unleavened bread. Right? In verse 16, when the gentlemen are ready to go, then the men set out from there and they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. Now, Lot's story is a little bit different. When they're getting ready to leave, they're getting ready to leave because bad stuff is about to happen. Right? God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and the angels are saying, you need to get out of here. Right? And it switches back. It's kind of interesting. We don't have time to go into this tonight, but it goes back and forth between calling them angels and men. But when it was time to go, verse 15 of chapter 19, as morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered, right? He wasn't ready to go with them. Abraham bargained for the righteous, right? When he figures out what God is going to do, and by the way, he figures out who he's talking to, he bargains for the righteous. Surely you won't destroy everyone. Surely you won't destroy the righteous people. What if there are only this many righteous people? Will you destroy everything for that? No, 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 no. Right? He gets it down to 10, but he's bargaining for the righteous. And of course, we know that his nephew Lot is there, and one suspects he's arguing or bargaining for Lot, arguing on behalf of Lot. How did Lot bargain? Lot bargained selfishly. Remember the men who came to the doors asking for him to send the men out that we may know them? Verse 6 of chapter 19, Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." All right? Okay, he recognizes what they're doing is wicked. "Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." It's pretty easy to look at that and see Lot as being more concerned for his own status, his own situation, and he bargains selfishly. It goes even again in chapter 19 and verse 19. "Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight." They're fleeing the city at this point. "And you have shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I cannot escape to the hills lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." Right? He's bargaining selfishly for what he wants. Right? So we see the connections between these 2 stories. And we have to wonder, what is the point of telling these stories in this particular way, where we see the similarities in them back to back? These scenes have been crafted in such a way as to encourage us to compare Abraham and Lot. So when you see these parallels in the stories, this is a question for us to discuss a little bit. What conclusions do you draw?
I didn't realize that when he went to Zor, saved that city.
That's certainly, you can sort of get a good picture of Abraham and how he has come down to us as a righteous man, a man of faith, a man with the big picture. A lot is just the like not completely the opposite, but certainly opposite.
Lot is a good man, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we want to talk about Paul writing about Abraham in Romans, we probably also need to think about Peter writing about Lot in 2 Peter. Lot, that righteous man whose conscience was plagued by the things that he saw going on around him. Right? He's not a bad man, but is he the same man that Abraham is? And I think clearly when we look at this, the conclusion that we're supposed to come to is there's something special about Abraham over and against Lot. Right? And if we read a little bit further, after God destroys the cities, look at chapter 19, verse 29. "So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Why was Lot rescued?
Abraham.
Not because of who he was himself, right? But because of who he was to Abraham and who Abraham is to God. God remembered Abraham. God saved Lot not because he was so worthy, but because of his relationship with Abraham. Right? So here's an example of two stories that characterize Abraham and Lot. The narrator never comes out directly and says, now Abraham was more righteous than Lot. But isn't that what we get from reading the stories back to back and seeing the similarities, being invited to make the comparison because of so many similarities between these stories? And we come to the conclusion, Abraham is more righteous than Lot. And then we find out at the very end that when God destroyed the cities, he did it. He saved Lot because of Abraham. He remembered Abraham. All right. So that's one kind of comparison that characterizes Abraham. Another one is Abraham with himself. From the beginning of the story to the end of the story. Look at this. Abraham, before Genesis 22, he did some good things, right? He went where God told him to go. We're told several times that he called on the name of the Lord. On multiple occasions, he built altars to the Lord. He gave to Melchizedek. He refused plunder from the king of Sodom. He obeyed the covenant of circumcision. He's doing some good stuff. And it's all kind of capped off by the statement in chapter 15, verse 6, after God tells him, you're going to have a son, and I'm going to give you this land. It says, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Right? So Abraham, we see some high quality things in his character. But we also see some things that are not so good. He tells Pharaoh that Sarai is his sister. The first thing that he says to God, also in that chapter 15, if you look at it, the voice of Abraham doesn't appear anywhere in the story until chapter 15, verse 2, right? At least in terms of talking to God. And God says, fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what do you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. Right? So his first interaction with God is sort of, I want to believe you, but what are you going to do? Because I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it yet. Right? And then, ladies, I'm very sorry to tell you this, but I think that it's a bad thing that Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai, his wife, chapter 16, verse 2. But men, this is not carte blanche to ignore your wives. This has context. You have to have the context now. Now, in chapter 16, verse 1, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Now, as we're reading this, if we don't know the rest of the story, you probably don't think about this as being a good or bad thing. It just is. This was their culture. This is the way things were sometimes done. But in the context of the story, God has said, you'll have a son. Now, interestingly, at this point, he has not said where that son will come from. Right? So it's conceivable that he could think, well, maybe this is how God's going to work it out. but he listened to the voice of Sarah, and I think that's a problem. In chapter 20, he told Abimelech that Sarah was his sister. Now, why do these two that I have arrows drawn to on the slide, why do these two stand at such great odds? On the one hand, Abraham believed the Lord and he credited to him as righteousness. But a few chapters later, he told Abimelech Sarah was his sister. For the sake of time, I'm going to jump in and give you the key. In chapter 17, in between these two sections, God goes to great lengths to tell Abraham, you're going to have a son with Sarah. So when Abraham later goes to Gerar and encounters Abimelech and says, Sarah's my sister, what is he doing? He's endangering the promise. If she goes into his harem, even if she comes out later, whose child is it? He's endangering the promise. This is a mega bad thing, right? Because he believed the Lord that he's going to have a child. And in chapter 17, he's told that it's going to be with Sarah. And in chapter 20, he gives her up to some other man and threatens the promise that God has made. Now, God intervenes and fixes things. But this is Abraham before Genesis 22. Look at Abram in chapter 22. When God calls him, he says, here I am. Abraham's the first one to say that, but we remember other stories in the Old Testament, don't we? Where that's the response of God's faithful servant. Samuel, Isaiah, right? Abraham was the one who said, here I am, when God called him. We see again the man of action at chapter 22, verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. No questions, just action. Verse 5, then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Now, we know the rest of the story, but if we were reading this for the first time and we had all of Abraham's background as we were reading it, do we believe that Abraham believes this? Isn't there some uncertainty? Is he just telling them what they want to hear? Is he saying something to make Isaac more comfortable? Or does he really believe it? Now, we read the rest of the story and we know he really believes it at this point. But if we didn't know the end, and we knew everything else that had come before, and we'd read it carefully, and we saw what seems to be wavering in his faith, we'd have to question that. When Isaac asked him in verse 7, my father, and he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Again, we know with hindsight that he believes this. But if we were reading this for the first time with only what we've seen beforehand to go by, we have to wonder, does he really believe it? Or is he just telling Isaac something to get him to continue with the journey? When he gets there to the place that God had told him, again, we see this whirl of activity. He built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And he reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. Action, action, action. No wavering, no second guessing, no questioning. He's going to do it. And of course, the angel stops him and says, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, verse 12, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Interestingly, both of the times when Abram offered up his wife as his sister, it said because he feared what Pharaoh or Abimelech would do. So it's not accidental. It's not just a flourish on here. I think it's very meaningful that he writes here, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Right? And so Abraham makes the sacrifice. And here's the payoff for the listening to the voice part. The very last thing that the angel says to him is at the end of verse 17, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Abram's listening to the right voice here at the end of his story. Right? So what made it possible for Abram to do all this, right? How did this guy who's too scared to claim his wife as his wife, who asked God, what are you really going to do for me? Who does express some doubt here and there and some uncertainty at the very least. What has happened that made it possible for Abraham to do all this? It's actually really simple. What happened in chapter 21? Isaac was born. God fulfilled his promise of a son through Sarah. And that seems to have flipped the switch with Abraham. There's no longer any doubt. God is faithful. He's going to make it right. I want to show you why I think this is true, and it has to do with a word that exists that pops up over and over throughout this story. We're going to have to run through it pretty quickly because of time, but it's really important to see this, I think. The word is to see, or a form of the word to see. And we miss this in some of our English translations because we use different words. But in Hebrew, this word to see, or forms of it, appear throughout the story. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw what? The land, the good land toward Sodom. After he goes there, God comes to Abraham and says, lift up your eyes and see this land that I'm going to give you. And he says, look, north, south, east, and west, it's all going to be yours. Guess what was east? The land that Lot just went to take. God says, it's going to be yours. See it. Hagar, when she's out wandering in the desert in chapter 16, this is super important. When she's wandering in the desert and the angel appears to her and says, she's pregnant, she hasn't had the child yet. She called the name of the Lord just like Abraham did, who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here, I have seen him who sees me. Some translation will say looks after me. It's the same word, who sees me. Right? You are a God of seeing. I have seen him who looks after, or who sees me. And in Hagar's voice, we actually have what I think is the key element of the story. Who is God? God is the faithful God who sees, who looks after me. Hagar voices it. Abraham comes to learn it later. When he has the problem with Abimelech and he's given Sarah to him, and Abimelech comes back to him in chapter 20, verse 9, then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And he goes on. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? Hagar gets it. She understands who God is. He's the God of seeing, the one who sees and looks after me. Abimelech poses the question to Abraham at the lowest point in the Abraham story, really. He's already received the promise that he's supposed to have a son with Sarah, and he gives her up and threatens the promise, endangers the promise. And the person who perpetrates that, the other person, main character who's involved in that whole act, says to Abraham, chastises him really. We'd say, what were you thinking? And can't you hear? That's kind of the question that probably is going on in God's mind. What did you see that you did this thing? The answer is he hasn't seen clearly yet, has he? When Hagar is out in the desert again in chapter 21, this time with her son Ishmael, and there's no hope and she's gone a distance away and the child is crying out, God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water, and he saved her. He saved Ishmael. But again, that key word, she saw. He opened her eyes and she saw. Abraham, in 22, he lifted up his eyes and saw the place that the Lord had in mind. He said, God will provide for himself. Guess what provide actually is? God will see to it. In Hebrew, it's the word to see. God will see to it for himself. He lifted up his eyes and looked. He saw the ram trapped in the thicket. I'm sorry, and that again, that's that's right. And then he named the place, the Lord will provide, but the word is see. The Lord will see to it. The word see binds all of these stories together. I've listed 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've listed 10 occurrences. There are 31 occurrences of that word in these 11 chapters. It's a theme that binds it all together. What have you seen? Hagar saw the God who sees her. Abimelech asked Abraham, what have you seen that you would do this? And so where do we end up? I love these stories that God gives us in the Old Testament, mainly because we can discover through them who God is and what his plans are for us. I love them because we meet the people who are part of God's plan to redeem each one of us. Some of these people were evil, but they couldn't ruin God's plan. Some of these people were good and they helped to advance God's plan, but all of them were human. They were imperfect. And it may sound strange, but I actually draw some comfort and some encouragement from their imperfection, because we know that God's plan to redeem us was fulfilled in Jesus. The imperfect people who were involved couldn't keep that from happening. And if that's true, then maybe God can use me, imperfect as I am, to also work in his kingdom. But thinking about me in the place of Abraham, I can imagine myself questioning, wondering, God, when, how is this going to work out? It's really hard for me to see myself being capable of being the Abraham on the mountain who's ready to sacrifice his only child. It's much easier for me to see myself trying to do everything on my own and wondering how God's going to fulfill these promises that sometimes seem kind of impossible. I think the beauty of the Abraham story is that the Abraham that we meet at the beginning of the story probably couldn't see himself on Mount Moriah either. Like each one of us, he was imperfect. Paul wrote that Abraham didn't weaken in his faith, but he laughed at God's promise. Paul wrote that no distrust made Abraham waver, but he questioned God how he and Sarah could have a child at their age. Paul wrote that Abraham was fully convinced that God was able to keep his promises, but he fathered a child with Hagar just to be sure he would have an heir. So how could Paul write these things about Abraham? Coming back to the point where we started this story, Abraham sometimes did foolish things, but even when he was making mistakes, he was listening to God. Even when he didn't understand, he was listening to God. Throughout the story, we read about God making promises to Abraham and Abraham listening to God. And the longer he listened, the more clearly he began to see. Like Hagar, he began to see the God who saw him, the God who cared for him, the God who showed him steadfast love. And when he saw clearly, he showed great faithfulness, willing to sacrifice Isaac, the son of the promise, his only son. So I think it's a useful thing for us to think about the question to us being, what have we seen? Have we seen the God who sees us? We have difficulties in life. We might even be angry about what God has done or what has happened to us in our life. But this is only for a little while, and God is faithful. He will keep his promises. And so the question is, will we respond in faithfulness to his faithfulness? Will we pursue our own journey of faith? We need to lift up our eyes, look beyond the difficulties of this life, see the God who sees us, be faithful to the God who is faithful to you. And to me, that's the beauty of the story of Abraham's journey of faith. He learned that God is faithful, and that made all the difference in his life. So hopefully that's a little bit different look at the Abraham story than maybe you've seen before. You got some things to look at more closely. There's plenty more where that came from. We could do most of this whole series just on the Abraham story if we really wanted to dig out a bunch of the details. But it's a beautiful story. It's an encouraging story. And I always enjoy taking a look at it and looking at it more closely. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it as well. And
Thanks a lot, Bruce. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Bruce.
All
It's a
right.
good look at it.
It's good. We enjoyed it.
All right. We'll see you next week, I hope.
Yep.
The story for next week is Gideon, I believe. I better look at my notes. I forgot what the next story is.
What?
Is it clap?
Oh.
You got to clap.
I guess I'd never really thought too much, Bruce, about that second deception there with Abimelech being that harsh on the, that harshly that he dealt with God's promise.
Yeah.
That's really quite a point.
Yeah. It's almost stunning because of the statement in chapter 15 and then how Paul plays on that in Romans. Abraham believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. And what he was agreeing with him there, what he believed him about, was the first time that God said, you're going to have a son. And then chapter 17, he says, it's not just with anybody, it's with Sarah. And then after that, he endangers the promise. It's and again, we don't have the narrator stepping in to tell us, hey, this is really, really bad. We have to read carefully and closely and in big chunks, right? If we're just taking this a chapter at a time, we might miss that. But reading in big chunks, reading carefully. I'm a big believer in marking up your Bible and especially with these narratives with voices. I'm not trying to keep everybody hanging around. If you need to go, that's fine. But I am going to share my screen one more time and just kind of show you an example of something that I've done. But this is this is what I've done with an electronic Bible. And so I've got different colors for the different voices and different highlights for the key words. And you can begin to see all the flow of things. And if nothing else, one of the really useful things about marking things up this way is that you have to slow down, right? You're not just running through it to read it as quickly as you can, but you have to pause and think about how you want to mark it up, and it takes longer to underline stuff than it does to actually read the words by themselves. And so you can see the parts that are written as dialogue, and I use different colors for different voices and so forth. But you can really begin to see the focus, right? And yeah, look at this in chapter 17. You think God is interested in telling him about his offspring and he's going to make him a great nation? Look how many times that's occurring in just those few verses. He's really encouraging him. This is the way it's going to happen. And we make a specific note here, you know, Abram says, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. And then we're off to the thing that Doug kind of brought up here after class. Right? We didn't even get to talk about laughing. That occurs all through here as well. And it actually ties the stories together even with Lot. When Lot tells his sons-in-law that we need to get out of here, it says it seemed they didn't believe him. It seemed to them as if he were jesting. The same root word. They're laughing at him. So Abram laughed. Sarah laughed. Lot's sons-in-laws laughed, and it actually appears a few more times as well. So that's one thing that's really useful to kind of slow down and see things a little bit more clearly, is just take some time to color in the voices and key words that you see repeated over and over. Right? So in the meantime, I did confirm Gideon as the next story we're going to look at in Judges 6 through 8.
Good deal.
All right.
Well, thanks again, Bruce. Appreciate it.
You are welcome. I enjoy doing it.